Welcome to Rule the World, the art and power of storytelling. Storytelling is what connects us as humans, and for brands, it is no different. A well-told story can effectively position your brand in the minds and hearts of your audience, and can convert thoughts and feelings into results and revenue. On this show, we dive into the unique and recurring principles of world-class storytellers from every walk of life to help you level up your storytelling skills and knowledge to drive real, measurable results for you and your organization. Here's your host, Paul Furlong.
Hello and welcome to Rule the World, the art and power of storytelling. My name is Paul Furlong, Creative Director at Opus Media, and I imagine you're listening to this podcast because you know the power of storytelling. Now I want you to bring that power to your own writing with Roger Schulman at thewritercoach.com. Roger's unique coaching method connects your personal story to whatever you're writing, giving it heart and depth. The result? Your presentation, website copy, keynote address, or screenplay becomes compelling, entertaining, and persuasive. Roger is the winner of a British Academy Award and nominee for the Oscar and the Emmy. So go to thewritercoach.com and schedule a free discovery session. Let Roger bring the Hollywood to your writing. Today's guest is James E. Cutting. He's a cognitive scientist, researcher, and professor in the Department of Psychology at Cornell University in New York. He's known most recently for his research studying how the movies in American cinema have evolved over the years in their structure, their physical attributes, and their narratives, and he has published over 100 scientific papers and 3 books. So James, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Can we start with you telling us a little bit about yourself and where your passion for film and for storytelling comes from?
Sure. I think when I was a late teenager, I had people ask me, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I didn't know, but I said, well, I think I want to be either a minister, an actor, or a teacher. And it only took me a couple months to realize it's really all the same thing. They're all storytellers of some kind. I couldn't really stomach some of the things one needed to do as a minister. I decided that being an actor was probably a profession that I might not succeed in. So becoming a teacher and then eventually an academic seemed like it was the right thing to do. And as an academic, whether we're writing or teaching, we're basically telling stories. And I can't say that I was interested in that aspect until probably about 10 years ago. And then I realized, the stories I tell in class, I want to make them it's a performance in class, and I need to perform them reasonably well. The content is there. And I used to choreograph my lectures. Anytime I changed a point, I would change a position in the room and, things like that. So I hadn't studied stories really until I started studying movies, which was about 10 years ago.
And what was it that started you studying films? Was it a particular film that you watched that made you think that was the route that you were going to take?
Well, yes and no. So let me tell two pieces of a story. One is that there was certainly a time in my life, particularly in the 60s and the 70s, where I felt that I saw all the important films, Bergman, the whole deal. And then, I became older. I had a family. I had 2 young daughters. There was a span of what eventually turned out to be about 20 years where I saw no films. And so there was this kind of gap. I wanted to understand, I wanted to see the films that I had missed, and I wanted to understand how things had changed. The second story is one with my daughters. And when they were young, and let's say they were, 4 and 7, as happens in many families, we would watch the same film over and over. And the particular film we watched was Sound of Music. Good family film. Kids like it. It's about kids. It's about adults. But we watched it over and over and over and over. And as we watched it, I began to notice that in some scenes, there were the usage of different takes made on different days. So there's one particular scene where There's the children have overturned a boat when their father comes home with a new potential wife, and they get all wet, and they're dressed in these pretty outlandish clothes. And there's a dialogue that happens between Maria and Captain Von Trapp. And if you look in the background in some of the shots, it's bright, crystal clear day, beautiful mountain in the background. And on other shots, it's incredibly hazy and you can barely see the mountain at all. And it goes back and forth like 7 or 8 times. And, this mountain takes up seemingly about a third of the screen. And yet, no one really notices this. And it took me, maybe 6 or 7 times watching The Sound of Music to really pick this up and realize what was there. The fact that we don't notice such things, I just think was incredibly interesting. And so when other things, got finished up, I finally decided, well, movies are an interesting thing to study. Let me do it.
And so what was it about the stories that movies tell as opposed to the stories that maybe a play tells or a book tells or maybe a painting tells? What was it about the stories that movies tells that particularly interested you? Sure.
The importance, I think, of movies and just popular movies is related to a concept that in cognitive sciences and philosophy and elsewhere is called theory of mind. And the idea is that you get a chance to get into the heads of a protagonist or some of the other characters in a story. And they've clearly always got a problem. Something comes up, they've got something to decide, and you get to witness and also go through the processes of the decision. And this, I think, is incredibly important because these protagonists, these people, are in situations that none of us will ever experience in our life, or very few of us will. But they teach us about decision making. They teach us about, how to deal with things that have sort of gone wrong or that are unexpected. And and that's, I think, incredibly important for us. It's a wonderful source of education for us. And there's actual data on children. When children watch movies, and this is movies, not TV shows, this is movies, not short little plays or things like that, children actually benefit from understanding other people by witnessing and being involved in a movie. Finding out how the protagonist or other characters actually react and what they do and how they solve their problems. So I think movies are incredibly important, and the stories told in movies are important. And the reason why movies, as opposed to books or other kinds of things, are particularly important, I think, is because movies, you get to find out, what's happened in like an hour and a half. Or sometimes in the shorter movies for the kids, about an hour. So this business of figuring stuff out and finding how it turns out is cascaded in front of us incredibly quickly compared to what happens in the real world. I mean, if we try to figure out what a neighbor is thinking or something, it may take years. If we're trying to figure out what's going on in a particular family member's mind, that may take days or weeks or even longer. In a movie, we can do it in 90 minutes. And that, I think, is incredibly useful for us because we can find out about how people think. I mean, we interact with people all the time. This is a chance to carry that out.
And to take that a little bit further, you talk in your in the paper that you wrote entitled Narrative Theory and the Dynamics of Popular Movies about the fact that popular movies follow a general narrative formula that's been perfected over time. And so we watch a movie and generally they can become quite predictable. But you say that can be quite a good thing. So why do you think it's important that we hear the same stories told over and over again with the same structure? And what's the psychological impact of this, do you think?
Right. So let me divide that up a little bit. I think that the structure of at least popular movies in the English language, mostly American movies, but also it's very difficult to say what a Hollywood movie is these days when, it's filmed in New Zealand and post-production is done in Germany and other kinds of things. But these are Hollywood movies and popular movies. They have the same structure, but they don't have the same content. So when you say we're watching the same movie, we're watching a similar structure. We're having expectations about the kinds of things that will happen, but just as one can claim that every person is different, one can also claim that every movie is different. Nonetheless, one can, for people, make generalized kind of comments about what people are like in general. And we can also, or at least my project has been to make estimates about how popular movies are in general. So they tend to have, not every movie, but most movies tend to start with a what I call a prologue. It's usually only about 2 to 4 minutes long, and it basically sets up the time and place, the location where the story is going to take place. Soon after that, we get into what's called a setup, and we're introduced to the major characters and their goals. The setup is basically a kind of slice of life. There's not typically a whole lot that's interesting there. I mean, it's a kind of status quo situation. And then something happens. It's sometimes called an inciting incident. There are lots of other terms for this kind of thing. And that incident causes eventually anyway, causes the protagonist or the protagonists to change their goals or to change the immediate goal, to try to do something or fix something or something like that. And that may mull about in their minds for a while, and then there is something that's it's called the lock-in, and the lock-in means, yeah, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to try to do this. So the bulk of the movie is really then about doing this task, accomplishing this goal, and it can be sometimes divided into 1 or 2 separate parts. I think most movies typically have 2 parts, one of them, 2 parts before the conclusion. One of them is called the complication, and this complication is essentially dealing with this new situation where you had this new goal, you're trying to accomplish this goal. Sometimes the complication ends with a first failure. You didn't reach the goal, something went wrong, some new information has happened, you have to deal with this. So what follows is sometimes called the development, and the development is typically where the protagonist really has to completely bear down, focus completely on this this goal, sometimes enlist other characters. So the development sometimes has a bunch of cross-cut sections where the protagonist and his or her henchmen are also working in different locales to get something done, trying to coordinate their efforts. And then the final large section of the film is called the climax. And, if it's an action film, it's usually a fight or a battle. If it's a drama, it's usually finally perhaps a confrontation of the protagonist with a boss or something like that. If it's a comedy, it might be the protagonist would still have had a goal, particularly in a romantic comedy. And in a romantic comedy, this is where the protagonist sort of couples up with the particular individual that they were targeting. And then most films have what's called an epilogue. And an epilogue is essentially a restating of the status quo. I mean, one of the things I like is the notion of, there's an important book in American, he must be a British author, Tilliard, on the Elizabethan world picture. And the note was that in Shakespearean plays, it's often the case that you start out with a kind of setup and how the world fits. And then the end of the play has a restoration of a status quo. That is, you return to either what was going on, or you leave the movie, in this case, the story, you leave it in a situation where it looks like it's stable. Maybe it's the old stability that was there, maybe it's a new stability, but that sort of ends it. And, that's the general structure. What corresponds to that are changes in shot duration and changes in music, and there are a number of changes that generally correspond with that. But I would say again, the content can vary enormously, and you can have flashbacks, and you can have all kinds of other stuff that go on, and they don't really change this structure all that much.
And so, what do you think the benefit is of hearing this same structure over and over again?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think I think audiences bring to movies a set of expectations, and I think filmmakers have a kind of implicit contract with those viewers to fulfill at least some of those. I think if you fulfilled all of those expectations, you would probably have a boring movie. But you need to fulfill some of those so that the viewer has the satisfaction of being able to predict stuff. As we go around in the world all the time, we are predicting what's going to happen next, and if we are wrong, then we have to readjust and things like that. So you want a viewer to be able to predict some of the stuff that's going to happen. So I think that's one of the causes of this. But another thing, and this is sort of more broadly cultural and gets back to sort of my motivations when I was trying to think about either being a minister or an actor or a teacher. Stories are the basis of culture, and they really always have been. And stories sometimes are justifying the current system. Stories are sometimes antagonistic to the current system. Stories are really how we get people involved, how we get listeners involved in things. There has to be a component of emotion. It's sort of very much something that's, stories are all around us, and we use them all the time, and there's a very high premium on telling a story well, although I think telling a story well is going to vary a lot on context.
Do you think using this formula where it is maybe a little predictable does detract a little bit from the story that you're telling? If you take horror films, for example, if we know where the jump's coming or the scare's coming, does that detract a little bit? And the same in maybe in a larger context of stories?
If it detracted, then no one would go see horror films. And yet horror films are one of the most popular genre out there, and they're often among the cheapest films to make. So they make a lot of money, comparatively speaking. And I think, people enjoy emotional swings, and the safety of a theater or television or even watching a movie on your cell phone, the safety of being the observer of one of these things is interestingly conflated with the actual emotions that are there. You can watch a horror film, simultaneously you are safe, and simultaneously you have the bejesus scared out of you. And people like that. People like the emotional swings when they're done in a safe situation.
So you've mentioned the word emotion a couple of times in the last couple of minutes. So looking at this, maybe removed a little bit from cinema, maybe looking at it from more of a macro viewpoint. and maybe looking at it from a more of a psychological viewpoint. How do you think storytelling affects our emotion and maybe our perception of things?
I don't think you have to have a good story, you have to have an emotional content. You have to have, so here's a really dull story. I have a headache, I go to the pharmacy, I buy ibuprofen, I take one, and my headache's gone. That's pretty dull. And yes, headaches involve pain, and people may, commiserate with that. But you have to engage a listener, and the way to engage a listener is to appeal to emotions. I will say that sort of a contemporary viewpoint in cognitive science is that you can't really separate cognition and emotion anyway. It's not like there are two separate brain areas or anything else. Emotion is something which we summon to improve memory. It's emotion is used to stimulate action on our part for things. Emotion is really not separable from perception or cognition in any, I think, useful way. But stories to be effective, since emotions are so important to individuals, stories to be effective have to appeal to emotions. And sometimes the emotions that are important are things like surprise, as in a horror film, or the emotions can be all over the place. And one of the things that we know about emotions, I mean, the typical research in emotions talks about, 5 or 6 states as if they are static. So there's anger and happy and sad and all of those kinds of things. That's not really true about people, and it's not really true about movies. Emotional states are mixtures of lots of different things, and they have different trajectories. So, in watching a movie or listening to a story, you may start out kind of in anger, and you may go to sadness. You may have both a combination of anger and sadness, and it may drift into some state of not necessarily happiness, but satisfaction or other kinds of things. Emotions are very dynamic and multidimensional, and stories stimulate the whole multidimensional space of emotion, and I think movies are really quite successful at doing that.
You mentioned there as well the word memory with relation to cognition. Is there an element of when someone's telling a story well, tapping into some of these memories, and does that help to trigger some emotions?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, to tell a good story, you have to make sure that your audience remembers important elements of that story. And in movies, of course, there's sometimes vague references to these kinds of things. There are things that are kind of put out there that later become important. So if you watch a film for a second time, you can see that there are obvious things that are there. First time around, they weren't obvious, but they probably acted as primes for things that came up. So memory is important there. And of course, we all have memories about, our own personal lives. And when we watch a protagonist do something or whatever, that is probably going to have some synergy with our own personal experience. And so we bring our own personal histories and to everything that we experience, particularly to movies and storytellings, and we immediately either identify or don't identify with those things. We recognize that they're similar or they're different, and we assess what's going on there. So, yeah, memories are, again, we can't really separate memories too much from emotions or cognitions or other kinds of things, but memory is incredibly important.
So what specific elements do you think a story needs to resonate on an emotional level?
interpersonal conflict, but more importantly, intrapersonal conflict. I think this gets back to a theory of mind, but if you watch a character and the character is, if you will, of two minds, one to go one direction, one to go another direction, this is, I think, primarily, this is the stuff that makes stories captivating. When the protagonist is of two minds, this clearly raises emotions. This, raises all kinds of issues that are there, and I think that's important. Action films often don't do that. That is, they are all about interpersonal conflict. You have a good guy and a bad guy. You have the protagonist and you have the antagonist, and that's a kind of simpler cognitive structure to deal with. And so action films can make lots of assumptions that make their storytelling a little bit easier than the storytelling that you might have in other films.
And so taking everything that we've talked about here in terms of the structure of the stories that we see in film and all of the elements that we've talked about in terms of connecting on an emotional level with story, how do you think we might be able to translate all of this into a business context to be able to bring us success when walking around in the business world?
Sure. This is when you ask that question, this is one that I probably feel least expert in answering. But my one guess is that the business world already knows these kinds of things anyway. I mean, story formulae have been around for centuries, if not millennia, and in business, and of course business has been around for at least that period of time. So I'm not sure that there's anything particularly new here. But there is one thing, that is, when you have a story, most stories are about a single or a small number of protagonists, and they work their way through things. And if you watch news programs, doesn't matter whether it's in the U.S. or whether it's BBC or elsewhere, there's often a kind of public interest kind of thing where you interview a few people. They have statements that they want to make, and then you try to generalize to the current social state or whatever. And that can have the form of a good story, but it's, at least from my point of view, socially problematic because as a scientist, I'm very skeptical of anecdotes, individuals talking about larger issues in society. I think we really need data, and that's, voting is really all about getting large bits of data. But in businesses, if you want to know, how your product works, then you need a lot of data. So, I mean, I guess I would point to Google or Amazon or any of these places that do this A/B testing, and you log on and you do, you change the screen, or you have some options that are a little bit different, and you get thousands upon thousands of responses in different kind of cases, and that's real hard data that you can use to refine your product. And it's not really about a story; it's about finding out how things do. So I think there is a danger in the story if you want to sell a product to a wide number of people. However, I think businesses, they know this. They know that they target audiences. They have a very good idea of the story they want to tell to different sets of people. And of course, this is fairly new over the last 25 years or so.
So I think if we can combine the statistics and the large data and turn that into far more than an anecdote, into a well-told, well-structured emotional story, then we might have the keys to success there.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
So just a couple of quick-fire questions, if that's okay, James.
Sure.
To your mind, who would you say is the greatest storyteller of all time, and why?
in thinking about this, I find myself a prisoner of my own time and place. And so, yeah, I could talk about Aesop. I could talk about Hazar Alfson, the source for many of the Scheherazade, 1001 Night stories. I could talk about Chaucer or Shakespeare or Beatrix Potter or whatever. But storytelling, when I think about it, is basically an oral tradition. And everything else is sort of parasitic on the oral tradition. And so it's a performance, and a storyteller should have, in my view, a really good voice. So the two storytellers that I find most persuasive to me are Studs Terkel, who was a radio host for 40 years in Chicago. And he told stories and interviewed people all the time. And Studs Terkel had this wonderful kind of raspy voice. And the raspiness of the voice, I think, was very important. And the other person is Martin Luther King. I mean, Martin Luther King had this incredible delivery, comes right out of the Black church in the U.S., amazingly influential, amazingly stirring. You know, it's hard not to have an emotional response to that. And it's a performance. Tells good stories. And I think one of the people I would like to include is the American humorist Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain. But there are no existing tracks of his own voice, at least none that we've been able to find. And there are descriptions of his voice, and, you know, he had supposedly this slightly, the southern accent with slight, homey flavor and slightly, perhaps a deep voice. And everybody who's performed the Mark Twain stories has always had a voice that's like that. But we have no idea what Mark Twain's voice was. And so without actually hearing his voice, I'm unwilling to say that he was one of the greatest storytellers of all time. I think the performance, the oral aspect, is incredibly important.
And can you recommend any good books or websites or blogs or podcasts on storytelling?
I'm focused on movies, and so I realize there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that's on literature and other kinds of things. But the person I read most about movies is David Bordwell, and he has a blog called Observations on Film Art. And a lot of what he writes is about the stories that are told in movies. And so, yeah, I mean, I think he is, I regard him as almost certainly the most important film historian alive today. And he tells good stories.
And finally, where can we find out more about you and where can we find you online?
So if you just went on Google and you typed in James Cutting Cornell, you'll find me. I'll be the first listed thing there. If you just type in James Cutting, you're likely to get English football players or other people that might be more interesting than me, but are not me.
I'm sure that's not the case, and I'm sure we'll have a search and find you online. So I can't thank you enough for today, James. It's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you for coming online. And,
thank you.
And having a chat with us. And we'll speak to you again soon.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Rule the World. Be sure to rate, review and subscribe to the show. And visit weareopusmedia.com for more resources based on today's topic, as well as access to more episodes that will help you develop your storytelling abilities. That's weareopusmedia.com. Thank you and see you next time.